Bonsoir et bienvenue au Centre Culturel Irlandais. Et merci à tous nos invités et à notre fidèle public d'être à nos côtés ce soir pour rendre hommage au grand Tomi Ungerer. Nous sommes très fiers de pouvoir valoriser les liens étroits que cet artiste engagé et si attachant avait noué avec l'Irlande, son pays d'adoption depuis plus de 40 ans. Je tiens à remercier la famille de Tomi et tout particulièrement Aria. Thank you so much, Aria. Ce fut vraiment un grand plaisir de concevoir et réaliser cette exposition avec Aria et avec Tomi lui-même. Le résultat que vous pourrez découvrir aujourd'hui est le fruit de nombreuses heures de réflexion et d'échanges pour sélectionner des œuvres, les mettre en résonance, concevoir une scénographie et réaliser un accrochage sur mesure. Et un grand merci aussi à mon équipe au Centre Culturel Irlandais. Tomi saw a scaled-down version of this exhibition, which hung on the walls of my office, small photocopies for about 6 months. And he visited the centre a couple of months ago, and he said to my great relief, "Je suis très content. Ich bin ganz zufrieden. I'm very happy." Dans les 3 langues. And when hanging the show with Aria, it was very comforting to me and I'm sure to Aria to feel that Tomi had given us his blessing, that he was happy with this show. So merci Tomi, cette expo c'est pour toi. So this evening we welcome journalist Sophie Gorman, longtime friend of the Ungerer family, who will be in conversation with Aria. And Sophie, of course, was supposed to interview Tomi this evening, as she had conducted a very successful interview with Tomi in July 2017 in West Cork. So maybe Sophie will speak to us a little bit about that wonderful interview. And I'm going to hand over now. I'm going to thank you both for being here, to thank you all for being here with us. It's a special, special exhibition for us, and it will be a special evening. Thank you, and I'll hand over now to Sophie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nora.
As Nora said, it is quite an emotional evening for everyone, I think, particularly for the family who are so wonderfully here, and for my family, because we have known Tomi all of my life, since my 3rd birthday, which I will explain, my traumatic 3rd birthday created by Tomi at a later stage. But I think, first of all, just because of this exhibition, I wanted to just, and this is going to be a little lopsided at the beginning, and then it'll be more of a dialogue, but I wanted to just give a little background to Godot, which is the subject of all of this exhibition that you're going to see, a truly remarkable exhibition. And Samuel Beckett writing Godot in Paris. Beckett had been in Paris for quite some time when World War II broke out. And in 1942, he was very much a part of the resistance. And actually, after the war, he was decorated twice for his work with the resistance. But a member of the Gestapo infiltrated his group in Paris. And he and his partner, Suzanne, had to flee because people were getting killed and captured. So Beckett and, from calling them first names, Samuel and Suzanne went out for a walk. And they pretended that they were just going out of their apartment. They brought nothing, but they kept walking. And they walked and walked and walked. And for 2 months, they hid around Paris. And then the pressure was too much, so then they went to the mountains in the southeast of France. And essentially, every day they would sleep, and every night they would walk and move and move and move. And what they were waiting for was the end of the war. And many people think that this plays very much into the characters of Vladimir and Estragon, who are the central characters of Waiting for Godot, who are waiting always for the arrival of the impossible. And they have these days of emptiness when they're waiting for Godot, or in the case of Beckett, it was thought to be that he was waiting for the end of the war. But Tomi Ungerer was never a man who would wait for anything. He was infamously, the busiest mind that I think anyone who ever encountered him would recognize, that he was never a man who waited for anything. He just kept going. It's impossible to list all the things that he was. He was a father, a husband, he was a farmer, he was obviously a famous children's book author, he was a sculptor, he made collages for all of his life, he was an incredible joker, he was a satirist, he was a graphic artist. I'm not actually, because I'll leave something out, and this conversation is going to be quite relaxed, so if people, particularly if you realize that I've made a terrible error in a date or a time, feel free to have pantomime cries from the family of, no! But Tomi was born in 1931 in Strasbourg in Alsace, and he was the fourth of 4 children, and when he was just 4 years old in 1935, his father died. And his mother took over. She moved the whole family, and actually his relationship with his mother, and I think it shaped all of his life and his relationship with women ever since. He has, as is emphasized by his family, his daughter and his wife, Tomi had a thing for strong women and always responded to strong women. And no stronger woman than his mother, who in that time when Alsace was being occupied, she would stand up and taught her children to stand up and look the Gestapo in the eye and have their say and never back down. And that was something that was strong throughout Tomi's life. As Nora mentioned, I interviewed Tomi in Bantry 2 years ago. And interviewing Tomi, even this interview, I was already mentally thinking how it would be, because it's something that it's an incredible privilege, but it's also slightly terrifying, because Tomi was a man who he believed in fear. He believed that everyone should experience fear right from the earliest age imaginable. And that feeds into my 3rd birthday. Because Tomi and his family, well, actually at the time it was just Tomi and Yvonne, they decided they had this life where Tomi had, in 1955, he'd gone to New York with just $60 in his pocket, and then in 1967, Vietnam happened, and he was very politically active and changed his place in America. And he and Yvonne, in 1971, ran they were essentially butchers. They ran a pig farm in Nova Scotia. At the end of that, that's probably not, but they had this very practical working life in Nova Scotia. And then they came, amazingly, miraculously, to the very, very furthest tip of Ireland, really the end of Ireland, the end of the world, where they bought, at that time it was kind of a ruined farmhouse on the edge of these cliffs beside 3 castles, ruined 3 castles and a lake. It's the most beautiful place possibly in the world. If you've not been, you should all beat a path. And while it was being renovated, they were staying in a nearby village called Goleen. And cut to my parents taking me and my older brother on our first family holiday to Goleen. And we stayed in Tom and Grace Hegarty's farmhouse, and the other guests were the Ungerers. And on my 3rd birthday, somebody foolishly decided to blow up a lot of balloons. And Tomi thought it would be brilliant in the middle of the party, in the middle of the happy moments. He had a corkscrew which had a wooden handle, and he would very violently stab the balloons. Not in a humorous way, but in just to make sure. I think I was crying already at that point. But then he took the inside out of a cushion, put his glasses on it, called it Baltimore, and made it speak in a really horrific voice as it chased me around. And that is my first memory. There were other memories with Tomi which were similar. I can only imagine as a child it must have been life peppered.
But we thought it was very funny, those things.
There were times.
We were inured.
Yeah, there were times. I do remember that another key moment in my childhood was when we went for Sunday lunch in the Ungerers, and they were in their house at this stage. And there'd been this lovely pig called Madonna, who was Aria's pet, or was it shared pet? And
Well, I chose the name anyway.
And Madonna lived just beside the front door in a little pen. She's very sweet. So we went for Sunday lunch, and we were sitting there having a lovely lunch. And Tomi asked us, were we enjoying the meal? And we said, oh, it's very, very nice. And Tomi opened the fridge door, and there was Madonna's head. That's typical Tomi humour, which I know certainly Luca's inherited elements of the humour, but there were many jokes held over the years. But Tomi and Yvonne, they moved to this place which was really remote, and to get there, it's quite the most extraordinary drive along cliffs and windy roads, and you just keep going until you can go no more. and it is stunningly beautiful. But it's a very small Irish community. And what was extraordinary was that Tommy had an expression. Tommy did love expressions, but one of his expressions was adapt and adopt. And he always believed that Alsatians were very good at adapting, and then they were adopted into communities. And the Ungerers, what was incredible was to have this very glamorous American woman and this very idiosyncratic Alsatian man suddenly thrust into this very remote rural landscape in Ireland, and they were embraced. I remember even there's a wonderful documentary which is showing here called Far Out Isn't Far Enough. There were scenes of local farmers collecting very broken and battered, kind of destroyed dolls that they found the way dolls somehow the remains of dolls always find their way everywhere. And they would collect them to present to Tomi Ungerer because they knew that he would do something with them. And you'll see elements, not of dolls, thankfully, but there's in this exhibition, there's elements of the way that he always found a new way to look at things. There's things that you'll recognize, and then you'll see that they're transformed into faces, implements. And visits to his house, there was a giant barn at the back, and they were always filled with pieces of rural machinery, farming machinery, that Tommy was somehow making into something. But it was quite extraordinary to see, there's only a couple of elements of them here, but just to see exactly what those things can become. It's a wonderful moment. But we should talk maybe a bit about the exhibition.
Yeah.
You ready? We have tissues.
We have tissues. No guarantees, guys.
So with Tommy, this exhibition, the work spans about 11 years.
10 or 11 years, yeah.
So he was always thinking, and the theme was always Godot.
Yeah, so he started working on that thematic, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, Mum, but I think around 10 or 11 years ago. And
had he ever met Beckett, do you know, or?
No, I don't think so, did he?
Their
No.
paths had never crossed, no. So he just was intrigued by this idea of the emptiness?
I think he was really intrigued, well, not intrigued, but he loved the absurd. Tommy loved the absurd, and I guess this idea of waiting for something that never comes maybe resonated with him on a lot of levels as well. Yeah, sorry, I don't feel that I will be massively articulate this evening, but I'm going to have probably blank spaces of my own, mirroring those in the space. I'll do my best to answer questions.
One of the first pieces we see, just to bring it back to the locality and the way that Tommy worked, but one of the first pieces that you see, it seems like a very obvious piece in terms of Godot. We see two chairs. We're not going to go through, don't worry, we won't spoil the surprise by discussing too much of the exhibition, but the obvious was never the obvious with Tommy. So these aren't necessarily Vladimir and Estragon's chairs from Godot.
No, not at all. So that's actually a really interesting collage because I think it's very much about presence and absence and waiting. So there's actually a story behind that one because we were in Crookhaven one day and Tommy was being interviewed and we had taken the interviewer and the photographer for lunch in the pub there. And when we got there, he found out that the owner of the pub's wife had just died. And then after we had the lunch, we went outside and we were sitting at a table around the side wall of another building and he saw that chair, just empty chair in front of the wall. So he asked the photographer to take a photograph of it to send to him. And so he created that collage from that one photograph. But in the collage there are two chairs and there's like a crack in the wall. So there's this real sense of like presence and absence, I think. And it's funny just to say about the selection and the show that, Nora and I made this selection already in the autumn, including all the groupings. So the show is in groupings. So all the groupings were chosen, where everything would go on which part of which wall. That was already, and we had created like a mini version of the space in her office. So her office, all the walls had the layout for the show. And it's, so none of these decisions about where everything went were made after Tommy dying. They were all made when he was still full of beans and very much alive, and he was very happy about the whole thing. But there are some things where now, in retrospect, we look at the wall and we kind of go, oh my goodness, how bizarre are some of those choices. They have like a different layer of resonance, and I think that collage in particular is, yeah. I see it so differently now.
There also is a lot of, to move away, there's also a lot of World War II references, which obviously feeds
Yeah.
into Beckett's experience at
Yeah.
the time and of what he was putting into
Yeah.
what was coming from
Yeah.
him to.
Yeah.
There are lots of trains and waiting
Trains and train stations, and there's one collage where you see a soldier who has like the French tricolour band, but a made up symbol by Tommy. And Tommy always said it was related to the French soldiers who gathered up Jewish people and handed them over to the Germans. Something which he was always really, really so upset about, and I think as well because it was kind of brushed under the carpet in France for so long. Yeah.
Well, Tommy was always, though, very political, so he
Yeah.
never shied away
Yeah,
from
absolutely,
dealing with it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think Tommy loved train stations. We spent a lot of time over the years in train stations, waiting for trains, getting on trains, off trains, and there is an amazing energy in train stations. But if you think about train stations in times of conflict or war, they're also places of deep sadness and,
And
waiting for people who never come back, or saying goodbye to people who never come back, or
or
yeah.
taking people away.
taking people away.
Yeah, which obviously features
Yeah,
quite a
so
lot.
there's a lot of resonance on that level as well in the collages. A lot of tracks, train tracks going to nowhere.
Can you speak a little about the methods? Because Tommy, as I mentioned, was making collages for all of his work. This was not a recent thing, this is something he's done forever. But for this particular one, there's certain elements that repeat some certain ways of working.
So he started making collages, and Therese, dive in if I'm making art historical mistakes. We have the Tomi Ungerer expert in the audience, so correct me if I make mistakes. But I think Tommy started making collages already in the 1950s. Some of his very first works, graphic works, included collage elements. And actually all his adult life he was collecting source material for collages. All, for everything from newspaper cutouts to doilies to he used to have a subscription to the Undertaker's monthly magazine in America, or Sears catalogs, all kinds of postcards.
It's a
So
great
he's
magazine.
been building up all this amazing stockage of images to work from. So that's one aspect of it. But then, so he did a lot of collages, which became a book, Schnippschnapp, which have collage element, but with a lot of drawing in them as well. But these collages, there are drawn elements, but it's much more subtle. So you really have to, and we're lucky because we have this amazing glass on the work, so you can really look closely at the detail and see where there's, manipulations made using the pencil or the pen or Tipp-Ex or adding pastel or, different markers. So, but for a long time when he was making these collages, and you can see which ones are the older ones, because he had this very old black and white photocopier in the studio, and it gave like a really grainy image. So like one of the things that he would do is he would photocopy something and then manipulate it a bit and then put that back into the photocopier and do that and go through that process several times. And so in some of the collages you can see like the different stages of that process, because the same image is repeated and reused, but it's getting like more and more grainy each time, or there's different things that he's done to the image in between each time. So
one of the oldest pictures, or the oldest one, is just inside the door. It's called Lost Weekend.
Lost
and
Weekend.
If you look at that carefully, you can see the very different times that have been.
So it's interesting too, because collage is a lot about, well, there's the juxtaposition aspect, but it's also a lot about layering. So there's also these different kind of temporal layering in terms of source materials, but also in terms of using the photocopy process and then layering it with work by hand on top. And then in the last years, because eventually, and he always said, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do when this photocopier gives up, and of course eventually it gave up and died. And then he was given a new color photocopier by my godfather, Robert Pritz. And I think in the beginning he used to look at this huge fancy color photocopier, and he was a little bit scared, I think, because it's like, how am I going to, he had to learn how to use new technology, which was not something he did very well. But he did learn to embrace the color photocopier, and
You can see that certainly in one of the baby image, for example, yes. Because there is one person who's missing from the exhibition, and that is Tommy.
Yeah, so when he came to review the selection in November, he and Yvonne came to Nora's office to review the selection, and he took out one collage and he substituted, he added in one collage. So interestingly, the one collage that he took out was a self-portrait. You don't see his face, but he was digging in the earth and there was a big shovel. So he took himself out of the exhibition. And then he put in a screaming baby collage instead. Yeah.
And the work, though, that you say, because one of the key things that Tomi said himself and that you say yourself is that he never wanted you to intellectualize the work.
Yeah, Tomi never, he's not an artist who would make a piece of work and then have like loads of very, I don't know. I mean, he would look at something and sometimes it was like he didn't know what it was about until after he made it, but he didn't intellectualize his work. And I think that's one of the things about Tomi's work is, generally speaking, it's understandable. You don't need an art history degree to understand a Tomi Ungerer work. And so I am trying to be careful to not go down the intellectualizing pathway, because I don't think Tomi would be very happy.
So I've just to mention a couple more of the pieces, and then I think we should raise a toast to Tomi and then go and see the exhibition. But there's a couple of others. Obviously, in Godot, I went to China with the Gate production of Godot years ago, and all the Chinese people, they just said it's God. Oh, God. Oh, it was the first. They had no problems understanding what Beckett was about. They just said that's what it is. But there is a picture of a headless pope.
Yes,
that's obviously there's a whole religious section.
Yes, there is.
Yeah, including my favorite picture, which is loads of thumbs.
Yes, and those are Tomi's thumbs. So he is actually in there somewhere. A friend of his, a photographer, Luc Bergeau, worked with Tomi in a whole series of photographs of Tomi making various shapes with his hands. And I think as he aged and his hands became more wrinkly, he really enjoyed how he could do like weird things with the flesh. And so they made a whole series of photographs. So the hands in that collage are Tomi's hands. So he is.
And there's quite a lot of Ireland in the. There's the National Gallery of Ireland features in.
Yes, there are two collages that feature the National Gallery in Dublin, and then there's also a photograph or an image that has you can see the view from Tomi's house with our dogs are in it.
The dogs, yes, that's very much a Three Castles. If you want a taster of what Three Castles Head is like. That's the.
But there's a lot of Ireland, I think, as well in terms of if I think of Tomi working in the studio and looking out to the sea and the sky and the rocks and the storms and the open space, and there's a lot of negative space in the collages, and there's something quite elemental about a lot of the work, and I feel that Tomi always talked about the horizon line. So he always said, like, when you are by the seaside or if you're in the desert, the horizon line is horizontal, and he really loved that image. Then when you're in the city, the horizon line is vertical, he always said. And so I think there's a lot of play there as well between the urban vertical horizon line and then the open kind of Irish horizontal landscape and horizon.
Well, I think we should leave the last words to Tomi, and I think we should all go and get a glass of wine and raise a toast to Tomi Ungerer.
And I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here. It means a lot, and Tomi was really, really, really excited about this exhibition. And thank you, Nora, and thank you, Rosetta, and thank you, everybody in the team. You have been amazing. And thank you, Yvonne, thank you, Mom, for helping make all of this happen. And Luca for being here, and Joanne. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Sophie.